Catherine Brennan had not spoken a word in 3 days, her voice stolen by the terror of standing on an auction block in her torn cotton dress while men shouted prices for her body like she was livestock. And when the hammer finally fell and the stranger with cold gray eyes paid $200 for her, she collapsed into the dirt and vomited until there was nothing left inside her but the certainty that whatever mercy death might have offered was now replaced by something far worse. They dragged her to his wagon because her legs would not carry her, her wrists raw and bleeding from the ropes that had bound her, since the raiders took her from the burned remains of her family's homestead 4 days earlier. And as the stranger lifted her onto the buckboard, with hands that were surprisingly gentle, she saw in his face a weariness so profound that she wondered if perhaps they were both prisoners of different kinds of cages. The sun was setting over the ragged tent city that had sprung up along the railroad construction site in the Wyoming Territory, and Catherine understood, with the clarity that comes from absolute desperation, that the auction had stripped away every shred of dignity she possessed, that she was now property owned by a man whose name she did not know, and that at dawn, when the truth of who she really was came to light, whatever small mercy he might have shown her would vanish like morning frost under a merciless sun. If you are drawn to stories where human dignity hangs by a thread and the auction of a soul reveals truths that shatter everything we think we know about mercy and justice, subscribe now, because this story will take you to places where the price of salvation is measured in secrets that can destroy or redeem. The stranger's name was Daniel McAllister, and he was 39 years old, a railroad surveyor who had spent the last decade mapping routes through territories where most men feared to travel, his face weathered by sun and wind until it looked like the very land he charted. He did not speak to Catherine as they rode away from the auction site, did not explain why he had bid against the 3 other men who wanted her, did not acknowledge the way she pressed herself against the far side of the wagon seat, as if distance might protect her from whatever he planned to do. When darkness fell completely, the auction had taken place in a makeshift camp where the railroad company allowed traders and opportunists to prey on the desperate and the damned, where women taken by raiders or sold by destitute families ended up on blocks of wood while auctioneers called out their ages and the condition of their teeth. Catherine had watched 2 other women sold before her turn came, had seen the blank horror in their eyes that she knew mirrored her own, and when the bidding started, she had closed her eyes and prayed for death, because surely death was better than whatever waited in the hands of men who bought human beings like they bought horses or cattle. Daniel drove the wagon 3 miles from the auction site before he stopped near a stand of cottonwood trees where a small creek ran cold and clear. The moon had risen full and white, casting shadows that looked like the bars of a prison cell across the ground. And when he finally spoke, his voice was rough, as if he had not used it much in recent days. He said her name, Catherine, and when she flinched, he raised both hands slowly, palms out, the way you might approach a wild animal that fear has made dangerous. He told her that his camp was another hour's ride north, but that they would stop here first because he imagined she might want to wash the filth of the auction from her skin before they went further. He said he would walk downstream and give her privacy, and that there was bread and dried meat in the saddlebag if she was hungry. and then he climbed down from the wagon and disappeared into the darkness. Before she could find words to respond, Catherine sat frozen on the wagon seat for a full 5 minutes after the auction's new owner vanished among the trees, her mind unable to process the absence of violence, the strange gentleness in his gesture. The auction had taught her that mercy was a lie, men told to make their cruelty more bearable, that kindness was just another weapon wielded to extract compliance. And yet, here was this man who had bought her walking away as if he did not own her, as if she still possessed the right to privacy and dignity. She climbed down from the wagon on legs that shook so badly she nearly fell, and she made her way to the creek where the cold water ran over smooth stones worn by centuries of current. She knelt at the water's edge and looked at her reflection in the moonlight, and what she saw was a ghost, a hollow-eyed stranger wearing the face of the girl she had been before the raiders came, before her father died trying to protect her, before the auction stripped away everything she thought she knew about what it meant to be human. She washed in the creek until her skin was numb from cold and scrubbed raw from effort, trying to wash away not just the dirt, but the memory of men's eyes crawling over her body, the auctioneer's hands turning her face left and right so bidders could inspect her features, the moment when the hammer fell and she became property instead of a person. When she finally returned to the wagon, Daniel was sitting with his back against a wheel, his hat pulled low over his eyes, and he did not look at her directly when she approached. He said they should rest here for a few hours before continuing to his camp, that she could sleep in the wagon bed where he had laid out blankets, and that he would keep watch by the fire. Catherine wanted to ask him why he had bought her, what he wanted from her, when the violence would start, but the words died in her throat, because some part of her was terrified that speaking might break whatever strange spell had kept him at a distance, might remind him that the auction had given him the right to do whatever he pleased. She lay in the wagon bed, staring at the stars scattered across the vast Wyoming sky, listening to the crackle of the fire and the sound of Daniel's breathing. And she did not sleep because sleep meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant death. The auction played over and over in her mind, like a nightmare she could not escape. The faces of the men who had bid on her, the cold weight of the auctioneer's hand on her shoulder, the moment when she realized that the law would not save her, because in this wild territory, on railroad land, the only law was money, and the only justice was what men with guns decided to enforce. She had heard stories about women bought at auctions, about what happened to them in mining camps and railroad towns, about the ones who disappeared into mountain cabins or ended up in brothels in Denver and Cheyenne. And she knew that her fate would be no different just because Daniel McAllister had shown her a few hours of temporary mercy. At dawn, as the first light broke across the eastern horizon, turning the sky from black to deep purple to burning gold, Daniel stood and stretched and began preparing coffee over the fire. Catherine watched him from the wagon bed, studying his movements, trying to understand what kind of man spent $200 at an auction and then left his purchase untouched. He was tall, lean in the way of men who lived on horseback and ate irregular meals, and there was a stillness about him that suggested either great patience or complete exhaustion. When the coffee was ready, he brought her a cup without being asked, and as he handed it to her, their fingers touched briefly, and she saw him flinch. as if her skin had burned him. He said they needed to talk before they went further, that there were things she should know, and his voice carried an edge of something that might have been fear or shame. The auction had been 5 days ago by Catherine's count, though time had lost meaning in the chaos of her capture and sale, and in those 5 days she had learned that the world was far crueler than her 26 years of protected farm life had prepared her to believe. Daniel poured himself coffee and sat down on a flat rock near the fire, and he began to speak in a voice so quiet she had to lean forward to hear him over the morning sounds of birds and wind through cottonwood leaves. He told her that his younger sister Anna had been taken by raiders 8 years earlier, sold at an auction just like the one where he had bought Catherine, and that he had spent the first 2 years searching every camp and settlement between Denver and Salt Lake City, trying to find her. He said he never did find Anna, that he heard third hand from a trapper that she had died of fever in a mining camp in Montana, that by the time he reached the camp, there was no body to bury and no one who remembered her name. The auction yesterday had been the first he had attended since giving up the search for Anna, and when he saw Catherine standing on that block, saw the terror in her eyes, saw the way the men looked at her like she was meat to be consumed, something inside him broke open that he thought had healed over with scar tissue. He said he bought her at the auction because he could not walk away, could not let another sister, another daughter, another woman disappear into the brutal machinery that ground up human beings and spit out ghosts. He said he did not want anything from her, did not expect gratitude or service or compliance, that the $200 he spent was not a purchase, but a ransom, that as far as he was concerned, the auction was a crime, and she was a victim, not property. He told her that his camp was at a surveying station 15 miles north where the railroad planned to cross the Sweetwater River, that there was a tent where she could stay until she decided what she wanted to do next, that he would help her get to any town she wanted to reach or find any family she had left, and that until she made that decision, she was under his protection and no one would touch her or harm her as long as he drew breath. Catherine listened to Daniel's words and did not believe them because the auction had taught her that men lied as easily as they breathed, that promises were weapons designed to lower your guard before the real violence began. She said nothing, just stared into her coffee cup and waited for the other shoe to drop, for him to explain the price of his supposed mercy. Daniel seemed to understand her silence, seemed to expect it, and he stood and walked to the wagon where he retrieved a leather saddlebag from beneath the seat. He brought it back to where Catherine sat and opened it, revealing a small stack of papers and a considerable amount of money, far more than the $200 he had spent at the auction. He said the papers were a letter of credit from the Denver Bank and Trust, documents proving his employment with the Union Pacific Railroad, and a signed statement from the railroad's regional manager authorizing him to requisition supplies and hire workers as needed for the surveying operation. He said the money was his savings from 10 years of railroad work, nearly $800 that he kept in gold and silver coin because paper money was unreliable in the territories. He told Catherine that he was showing her these things so she would understand that he was not some drifter or criminal, that he had legitimate work and legal standing, and that if she wanted to, she could take half the money and the letter of credit and leave right now, ride to the nearest town, and start whatever life she could build from the ashes of the one the raiders had destroyed. The auction had not prepared Catherine for this moment, for the possibility that a man who bought her might actually mean what he said about setting her free. She looked at the money spread out in the saddlebag, more wealth than her family's farm had generated in 5 years, and she understood that Daniel was offering her something far more valuable than gold. He was offering her the choice that the auction had stolen, the autonomy that came from being a person instead of property. She raised her eyes from the money to his face, and for the first time since the raiders took her, she allowed herself to feel something other than terror and despair. She asked him why he would do this for a stranger, why he would spend his savings and offer her freedom when the auction had given him the legal right to do whatever he wanted with her. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant, focused on something Catherine could not see. He said that when Anna disappeared, when he finally accepted that she was dead and that he had failed to save her, he made himself a promise that if he ever had the chance to pull someone else from that same darkness, he would take it regardless of the cost. He said the auction represented everything wrong with the frontier, the way violence and greed reduced human beings to commodities, the way the law turned a blind eye because the victims were women and the perpetrators had money or guns or both. He said he could not fix the system and could not save everyone, but he could save Catherine. And maybe in saving her, he could save some small piece of his sister's memory, could prove that not all men who attended auctions were monsters. Catherine felt something crack open inside her chest, a wall she had built in the days since the raiders came. And behind that wall was grief so overwhelming she thought it might drown her. She had not cried since the auction, had not allowed herself to feel anything, because feeling meant acknowledging what had happened, meant accepting that her father was dead and her mother lost, and her life as she knew it was over. But Daniel's words, his strange and unexpected mercy, broke through her defenses, and she wept with a ferocity that surprised them both. She cried for her father, who died with a bullet in his chest trying to protect her, for her mother, who the raiders dragged away and who Catherine had not seen since, for the girl she used to be, who believed that the world was fundamentally fair and that good people were rewarded and that evil was punished. She cried for the 2 women sold at the auction before her, for Daniel's sister Anna, who died alone in a mining camp, for every woman who had stood on a block while men decided her worth in dollars and cents. Daniel did not try to comfort her or tell her everything would be fine or offer empty platitudes about time-healing wounds. He simply sat on his rock and drank his coffee and gave her the space to break apart without trying to put her back together. When her tears finally stopped and she sat hollow and exhausted, he asked if she was hungry, and when she nodded, he prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush and dried apples. They ate in silence as the sun climbed higher and the day grew warm, and Catherine realized that for the first time since the raiders came, she felt something approaching safety, as if Daniel's presence was a shield against the chaos that had nearly destroyed her. After breakfast, they loaded the wagon and continued north toward Daniel's surveying camp, following a rutted track that paralleled the proposed railroad route. The land here was rolling grassland, broken by occasional outcrops of gray rock and stands of juniper and pine, empty country where you could see for miles in every direction. Daniel explained that the railroad would bring dramatic changes to this region, that within a few years there would be towns and ranches and farms, where now there was only wilderness and wandering buffalo herds. He said progress was inevitable, but that it came at a cost. that the native tribes were being pushed off their traditional lands and that violence was increasing as desperation grew on all sides. Catherine listened to Daniel talk about the railroad and the future and the cost of civilization, and she thought about her own cost, about what the auction had taken from her and what it had inadvertently given her. She asked him what would happen when they reached his camp, whether the other workers would know she had been bought at an auction, whether they would treat her like property, regardless of what Daniel said about her freedom. He was honest with her in a way that she appreciated, even though the truth was difficult. He said there were 5 other men at the surveying camp, rough workers hired to help with measurements and site preparation, and that at least 2 of them had probably attended auctions themselves or known women who had been sold. He said he would make it clear to everyone that Catherine was under his protection and that anyone who bothered her would answer to him. But he admitted that his authority only extended so far, that in the wilderness, social rules were fluid and violence was always close to the surface. Pause here and tell me this. If you had been bought at an auction and offered freedom by a stranger, could you trust him? Would the trauma of being sold as property make trust impossible? Or would the gesture itself create a bond stronger than normal circumstances ever could? Drop your answer in the comments, because this question goes deeper than we might want to admit. They reached Daniel's surveying camp in the early afternoon. A collection of 4 canvas tents and a large supply wagon set up on a bluff overlooking the Sweetwater River. The 5 workers Daniel had mentioned were scattered around the camp, engaged in various tasks, and when the wagon arrived, they all stopped what they were doing and stared at Catherine with expressions that ranged from curiosity to calculation. Daniel introduced her simply as Catherine Brennan, a woman who would be staying at the camp under his protection while she recovered from difficult circumstances, and his tone left no room for questions or commentary. He showed her to a tent at the edge of the camp that had been his sister Anna's before she disappeared, a space he had kept empty for 8 years, like a shrine to hope that had long since died. The tent contained a cot with clean blankets, a small trunk for belongings, and a lantern hanging from the center pole. Daniel said he would move his own bedroll to the supply wagon so she would have privacy, and he reminded her that she was free to leave whenever she wanted, that the offer of money and safe passage still stood. Catherine stood in the doorway of the tent, looking out at the vast emptiness of the Wyoming Territory, and she realized that freedom was more complicated than she had imagined. The auction had taken everything from her, her family, and her home, and her sense of safety, and now this stranger was offering her a chance to rebuild from nothing. But she had no idea where to start or what kind of future was even possible for a woman in her position. She spent the first 3 days at the surveying camp, barely leaving her tent except to fetch water from the river and eat the meals that Daniel prepared. The other workers kept their distance after Daniel made it clear in private conversations that Catherine was off limits, though she could feel their eyes on her whenever she moved through the camp. On the 4th day, Daniel asked if she would help him with some of the surveying work, said he could use someone who could read and write to record measurements and keep notes. Catherine agreed, partly because she was going mad with idleness, and partly because she wanted to understand this man who had paid $200 at an auction and then asked for nothing in return. Working alongside Daniel, Catherine began to see the shape of his character, the way he approached problems with methodical patience, the way he treated his workers with respect, even when they tested his authority, the way he talked about the railroad not as conquest, but as connection, a way to link isolated communities and make the vast distances of the West a little less lonely. She learned that he had been orphaned young, that he and Anna had survived by taking whatever work they could find, that Anna's disappearance had broken something fundamental in his understanding of the world. He said he used to believe that if you worked hard and followed the rules and treated people fairly, you could build a decent life. But Anna's fate had taught him that the world was arbitrary and cruel, and that safety was an illusion maintained only by constant vigilance. Catherine told Daniel about her own life before the raiders came, about the farm her father had carved from difficult soil in eastern Colorado, about her mother's garden, and her younger brother who had died of scarlet fever when he was 7. She told him about the morning the raiders arrived, how her father had tried to negotiate, had offered them food and money and horses if they would just leave peacefully, and how they had shot him anyway because violence was easier than negotiation. She told him about her mother's screams as they dragged her away, about the way Catherine had hidden in the root cellar for 2 days before hunger drove her out, about the bounty hunters who found her and decided that selling her at an auction would be more profitable than helping her. The auction became a bond between them, a shared understanding of how quickly civilization could collapse into barbarism, how fragile the structures that protected the vulnerable really were. Daniel said he had spent years angry at a system that allowed auctions to exist, that turned human trafficking into legitimate commerce, but that anger without action was useless, that he could either rage at injustice or do something about it, one person at a time. Catherine asked him if he planned to attend more auctions, if his rescue of her was the first of many, and he admitted he did not know that the auction had cost him nearly 1/3 of his savings, and that he could not afford to make a habit of redemption. As the days turned into weeks, Catherine slowly began to reclaim pieces of herself that the auction had tried to destroy. She learned surveying techniques and became skilled at recording measurements. She helped prepare meals and organize supplies. She even started joining the workers for evening conversations around the fire. Though she rarely spoke, the trauma of the auction did not disappear. She still woke some nights, gasping from nightmares where she was back on the block. But the daily rhythm of useful work and Daniel's steady presence began to create a foundation on which she could imagine building a future. She realized that the auction, as terrible as it had also been a strange kind of liberation, that it had stripped away her old life so completely that she was now free to become someone entirely new. One evening, about 6 weeks after Daniel bought her at the auction, Catherine was helping him pack equipment for the next day's survey when she asked him a question that had been building in her mind for weeks. She asked if he had ever regretted buying her, if the $200 sometimes felt like money wasted on a stranger's problems, if he wished he had just walked away from the auction and kept his savings intact. Daniel stopped what he was doing and looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. He said that the money was the least significant part of what the auction had cost him, that seeing her on that block had reopened wounds he thought were closed, had forced him to confront his failure to save Anna all over again. He said that rescuing Catherine had not erased his guilt or brought his sister back, but that it had given him something he thought he had lost forever, a sense that individual actions could still matter in a world that seemed designed to crush hope. Catherine understood then that Daniel had needed to buy her at the auction as much as she had needed to be bought. that in saving her, he had been trying to save himself from the bitterness and despair that Anna's death had planted in his soul. The auction had brought them both to the lowest point of their lives, but it had also created an opportunity for connection that neither of them would have found in normal circumstances. She told him that she was grateful, not just for the rescue, but for his honesty, for not pretending that mercy was simple or that trauma could be easily overcome. She said she still woke up some nights certain that she was back on the auction block, but that the knowledge that someone had cared enough to pay $200 for her freedom helped quiet the worst of the panic. The railroad work continued through the summer and into early fall, with Daniel's crew making steady progress on surveying the route across the Sweetwater River Valley. Catherine became an integral part of the operation, her careful record-keeping and quick mind for calculations earning respect, even from the workers who had initially viewed her with suspicion. She learned that survival in the frontier required constant adaptation, that the rigid social rules of settled communities had no place in wilderness camps where everyone depended on everyone else. The auction had taught her that vulnerability could be exploited, but Daniel had shown her that vulnerability could also be strength, that admitting need and accepting help was not weakness, but wisdom. In October, word reached the camp that the Union Pacific Railroad was consolidating surveying operations and that Daniel's crew would be reassigned to work further west in Utah Territory. Daniel gave Catherine the choice to continue with them or to take the money he had promised and strike out on her own. And after a long night of consideration, she chose to stay with the crew. She told him that the auction had destroyed her old life, but had also freed her from limitations she had not even known existed, that working for the railroad gave her purpose and independence in a way that returning to farm life never could. Daniel said he was glad that her presence had made the camp a better place, and that if she wanted, she could continue working as his assistant with fair wages and equal treatment. The day before, they were scheduled to break camp and head west. A rider arrived with news that shook Catherine to her core. The rider was a U.S. Marshal who had been tracking the raiders who had attacked Catherine's family, and he brought word that her mother, Ellen Brennan, was alive, recovering in a settlement near Fort Laramie after being rescued from a raider camp 2 weeks earlier. The marshal said Ellen was asking for her daughter, that she had survived, but was badly wounded both physically and psychologically, and that if Catherine wanted to reunite with her mother, she should come to Fort Laramie as soon as possible. Catherine stood frozen as the marshal delivered this news, unable to process the possibility that her mother might still be alive after months of assuming she was dead. The auction had taught her not to hope, that hope was dangerous, that believing in positive outcomes only made the inevitable disappointment more painful. But Daniel, who understood trauma and grief in ways that most men did not, saw the war happening behind Catherine's eyes. He told the marshal they would leave for Fort Laramie immediately, that surveying schedules could be adjusted, but that family reunions could not wait. He told Catherine to pack whatever she needed and to prepare for a difficult journey both physically and emotionally, that seeing her mother after what they had both endured would be complicated in ways neither of them could predict. They rode to Fort Laramie in 3 days, pushing hard across country that varied from grassland to rocky badlands to pine forest. Catherine barely spoke during the journey, lost in thoughts about what she would say to her mother, how she would explain the auction, whether Ellen would blame her for not protecting her father, whether the trauma they had both experienced would create a barrier impossible to cross. Daniel rode beside her in silence, respecting her need for internal processing, occasionally offering water or food, but mostly just being present in a way that required nothing from her. At Fort Laramie, they found Ellen Brennan in a hospital tent, recovering from bullet wounds and exposure, and the kind of psychological damage that left scars no surgeon could heal. The reunion between mother and daughter was raw and difficult, both women crying as they held each other, both carrying guilt and grief and relief in measures too complex to untangle. Ellen looked decades older than her 52 years, her face gaunt, and her eyes holding shadows that Catherine recognized from her own reflection. They talked for hours, sharing pieces of their separate nightmares, Ellen's captivity with the raiders, and Catherine's auction and sale. And in the telling, they began the long process of rebuilding connection from shared trauma. Daniel stayed at Fort Laramie for a week, helping Catherine and Ellen navigate the complexities of reunification, dealing with military bureaucracy and legal questions about property and inheritance, and whether the Brennan farm in Colorado could be reclaimed. He spent his remaining savings buying supplies and arranging transportation, ensuring that Catherine and Ellen would have what they needed to rebuild their lives, whether they chose to return to Colorado or start fresh somewhere new. On the morning Daniel was scheduled to leave for Utah Territory, Catherine walked with him to where his horse was saddled and ready. She thanked him for buying her at the auction, for saving her life when he had no obligation to do so, for showing her that mercy and kindness could exist even in the darkest circumstances. She said she would repay the money when she could, that she would never forget what he had done, that he had given her back not just her freedom, but her belief that the world contained more than cruelty and exploitation. Daniel said the money was not important and that repayment was not necessary, that seeing her reunited with her mother was worth more than any amount of gold. He said he hoped she would find peace and healing, and that if she ever needed anything, she should send word to the Union Pacific Railroad office in Denver, and the message would find him. Catherine watched Daniel ride north toward the railroad camps and surveying stations that would occupy his life for years to come, and she understood that the auction had changed them both in fundamental ways. It had taken everything from her and given her the opportunity to rebuild as someone stronger and more resilient than she had been before. It had cost Daniel money and reopened emotional wounds, but it had also given him proof that individual actions could matter, that choosing mercy over indifference could alter the trajectory of another person's life. The frontier was unforgiving. The auction system was brutal. The railroad brought both progress and destruction, and the cost of survival was measured in compromises and adaptations that challenged every notion of right and wrong. But Catherine had learned that redemption was possible, even in the darkest circumstances, that being bought at an auction could paradoxically lead to freedom, and that sometimes the greatest gift one human being could give another was the simple recognition of shared humanity in a world that too often treated people as commodities. She had gone to that auction as property and emerged as a person, and though the scars would never fully heal, she carried them as evidence that she had survived what should have destroyed her. The auction at dawn had revealed who she really was, not a victim defined by trauma, but a survivor who chose to rebuild rather than surrender, a woman who understood that freedom was not given but claimed through daily acts of courage and connection. And in the years that followed, As she and Ellen carved out a new life from the ruins of the old, Catherine would remember the moment Daniel McAllister paid $200 for her freedom and proved that sometimes the value of a human life could not be calculated in gold or measured by any auction's hammer. If this story of survival, redemption through unexpected mercy, and the auction that paradoxically led to freedom has moved something deep inside you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that explore what it truly means to be human when the world tries to reduce us to numbers and transactions. And share in the comments, what does freedom really mean when it comes at such a terrible price?